Welcome to the Great American Male YouTube page. This is our first video. We're going to be posting more content here because some of the things that we talk about, it's a lot easier if we can show you the video of the content that we're discussing. So if you've tuned into this video, you can tell by the title, we're going to be talking about how Joe Biden corrupted the Supreme Court nomination process. So before he was president, before he was vice president, he was a senator from Delaware. And in the 80s, he happened to be the Senate Judiciary Chairman. Now, he not only corrupted the Supreme Court nomination process, but he also, in large part, corrupted politics in general. So when you finish this video, by the end, you're going to see a lot of what we're talking about Biden's influence on politics. And again, perhaps he did no more damage to any institution in America than he did to the Supreme Court nomination process. You all have seen what happened to Kavanaugh. Well, Kavanaugh was preceded by what happened to Clarence Thomas, and what happened to Clarence Thomas was preceded by what happened to Robert Bork. So who was Robert Bork and when did all this happen? This happened in 1987. Robert Bork was Reagan's third nomination to the Supreme Court. Now, at this hearing, as you know, Reagan had run in 1980 really as to two things as it related to the Supreme Court. First and foremost, he said that he was going to appoint the first woman to the Supreme Court, which he did when he nominated Sandra Day O'Connor. The second thing that he ran to do was to appoint justices to the Supreme Court that would overrule Roe v. Wade. Now, Roe v. Wade is not likely to ever be overturned. I know a lot of people think now it may actually be overturned. I do think that's unlikely. If you go to our Substack page, greatamericanmale.substack.com, we'll try to put a link in the description. We've got an article out there, and we've got a single-issue podcast why we don't think that will ever happen. But back in 1987, there was a real possibility that it would happen, and everyone knew it. And even though Reagan had run and won on this platform, and in those days you were given some latitude with your Supreme Court nomination, Biden, as a senator from Delaware and the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, was bent on keeping Bork off the Supreme Court. Now, how did he do it? Well, he did it by corrupting the process in a lot of ways, but perhaps no other way did he do it than by making what people were testifying to not really about the substance or the policies or whether it was good for America or the Constitution, but he made it into a soundbite contest. And so we're going to show you a lot about Biden. Again, this is from 1987, so we're talking 35 years ago. You're also going to be being able to see a little bit more about how much sharper Biden was. If you want to compare Biden today to Biden 35 years ago, you're going to see he's never been the sharpest, most smoothest politician. But you can tell in this video that we're going to look at here, you can see that he was a lot sharper and a lot more cognizant back then. So this is the Supreme Court nomination of Robert Bork. And so the way it works is the president nominates you to the Supreme Court. It's a lifetime appointment. The only way you won't be on the Supreme Court if you're confirmed by the Senate is if you die or if you're impeached. So that's it. And in the nomination process, it goes to the judiciary. Once it gets out of the judiciary, it goes to the full Senate for a vote. Now, at this point, before you interview the nominee, you invite certain witnesses, both pro and con, to discuss and investigate the nominee. So Robert Bork was the nominee, and one of the persons that was put forward as a witness on his behalf was a man named Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is a black conservative. He had written a great many columns at this time. He'd written several books. He wrote a book on economics. He was a well-known black conservative figure. Now, you have to understand before we start the video here, and we're going to get to it in a moment, that Biden knows all of this. He knows what Bork thinks. He knows what Thomas Sowell thinks. And their opinions are not in agreement. He has differing views on the Constitution, which is all fine. But I want you to, when we break this down, I want you to keep in mind here what he's looking to do in terms of getting sound bites that he can then politicize out in the public to make this a public spectacle. So without further ado, let's turn over and listen to Senator Biden from Delaware, 1987, interviewing Thomas Sowell, who's there to speak on behalf of Robert Bork. Take a listen.
And I'm going to use my 5 minutes now, if I may, and hold me strictly to the 5. Please give me a 1 minute notice. Let me ask you a couple questions. You think judicial activism, doctor, has hurt blacks. Judicial activism of eliminating restrictive covenants in deeds, eliminating segregation in schools, one man, one vote, literacy test. Do you consider those judicially active?
Well, as regards restrictive covenants, I can see no evidence that they did anything other than make some people feel good because it was symbolic.
So what he's talking about there, quite frankly, is he's talking about before the Supreme Court struck them down, you were permitted to put a restrictive covenant in a deed and prohibit certain people from buying into the neighborhood. So, for example, you could say on the deed and then pass it down and restrict people in the future from being able to sell to a black person. But one important thing, and I think this is part of the reason why Biden's going to move on pretty quickly from this, is that it isn't necessarily based on race. You could restrict the covenant based on religion. You could restrict it based on national origin. So, for example, restrictive covenants also, in addition to having racial restrictions, also had restrictions. For example, you couldn't sell to a Catholic or you couldn't sell to somebody that was Irish. So, anyway, the hearing continues.
As regards desegregation of the school system, that should have been done long before and on a much more sound basis. I've gone into this at great length in previous writings.
But are they?
You see, the problem is not whether you believe that school desegregation should have ended. I believe it should have ended long before.
Okay.
George Bork believes it should have ended long before. What he and what I have objected to are the principles used in that decision, because those principles take on a life of their own, and they come back to haunt you in other areas. Obviously, this old phrase, the hard cases make bad law, derived from that fact. You dream up a principle to reach this result, and then the principle has a life of its own.
So the principle of desegregating the schools.
No, that wasn't the principle. The principle was the reason that they picked for.
See, again, this is Biden in this typical, I'm just trying to understand. He's going to work this sort of aw shucks routine throughout this hearing here, and this sort of, I'm not really sure what you mean. The principle you shouldn't do. He was just trying to trap him. Now he quickly said, no, that's not the principle. But notice how if he had not caught him in that moment, if he had not said, no, that's not the principle, he's gonna go on here and explain what the principle is. Notice how Biden's trying to trap him. It didn't work. Anyway, the hearing continues.
Well, that's all I'm saying. Okay, the reasons they picked,
Yes.
Desegregating the schools, you and Judge Bork agree were the wrong principles, and they should have not. So the court shouldn't have done that.
No, the court should have done it.
Oh, okay.
Both of us have said the court should have done it.
I see.
And in my case, and I think in his case, the court should have done it a lot sooner.
How?
They should have ruled that it wasn't equal protection of the law, because nobody in his right mind believes that there was equal protection of the law in the Jim Crow era of these school systems.
I'm just trying to figure out what you're saying.
Yes.
Now, when they desegregated.
So again, what's going on here? And again, they kind of jumped around it a little bit. What's going on here is that Biden is trying to get him to say that desegregating the schools is something they disagree on, and they don't disagree on it. They know what the disagreement is. And what just so you understand, what's going on here is that before Brown v. Board, 1954 decision, and I encourage you, it's less than 10 pages. It's written in very plain English. Earl Warren wrote it that way specifically for that reason. You can go back and you can take a look at it. The prevailing law at the time was separate but equal. Separate but equal is Plessy versus Ferguson. Approximately 100 years earlier had said that it was okay to have separate facilities between blacks and whites, because even though they were separate, they were equal facilities. And that was the law of the land until 1954, when it was struck down. Now, there's a little bit of confusion here, because it was struck down on equal protection of the law. That's what it was. The Supreme Court ruled technically that the 14th Amendment, which required you have equal protection of the laws, did not permit you to have separate but equal facilities. Therefore, schools, to begin with, but later other things, were going to have to be integrated. And what they're talking about here, the philosophy that they're talking about, is that if you read the opinion, the court found that basically segregation of public education based on race instilled a sense of inferiority that had a hugely detrimental effect on the education and personal growth of African American children. That's the principle that Thomas Sowell is talking about here. Because if that's the principle upon which you desegregate the schools, then what else could you do? If as a judge you feel like this policy makes a certain group of people feel inferior, where's your constitutional underpinning or a thing that sort of keeps you grounded? Nothing. What Thomas Sowell is saying is that what we should have done is said it's based on equal protection of law, and you can't treat people differently. That's the principle that they're disagreeing with. Now, this is a little bit of an inside baseball conversation that's going to go on for a little bit. We're going to continue and let you hear it, and then we're going to talk about something else. But this goes on here about technically the 14th Amendment couldn't do it. And again, it just further shows Biden and his corruption. He can't just let Thomas Sowell say, listen, I believe that people should be treated equally regardless of race. He's trying to catch him into saying, oh, well, you think certain principles are bad and the court shouldn't be able to do the things that I want them to do. Anyway, the discussion continues.
D.C. schools. It's clear the 14th Amendment does not apply. Everyone agrees that the 14th Amendment does not apply to the District of Columbia. How would they have done it in the District of Columbia? Should they have just let it stand in the District of Columbia? Segregation?
No, in fact, Senator, it's interesting that you say that because I've gotten the first thing I ever wrote in on a public issue was in November 13th, 1950, in the Washington Star, in which I argued for the desegregation of the D.C. school system. So that
on what principle?
I had not studied nearly as much then as I have 37 years later, and so I hadn't worked it out. Nor do I think that I would want to work it out on the run in front of a large group of lawyers at this very moment in the time that's available.
Well, how about literacy test?
Before they get on the literacy test here, Thomas Sowell is such a good soul. He really is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with what he's saying there, and he has a humility. He says, I don't want to work it out in front of a bunch of lawyers. So Biden, lets that one go. Now he's on to the literacy test. And again, this is Soundbite City. Take a listen.
Was it judicial?
I see no reason why people shouldn't be literate in order to vote. The question is, if you have a black who comes in with his degree from Harvard, and the man behind the desk says, no, you're not literate, you can't vote, then this is what bothers me. People are talking about how judges should be sensitive to this particular group or that particular group. And if that means anything, if it means he's applying the law differently, that's precisely how blacks were held down for generations in the South.
So that's an inarguable point. That's an inarguable point. In other words, if you have literacy tests that apply across the board, then you can't say, well, this black person is not literate even though he clearly has a degree from Harvard, and this person who happens to be a white farmer who doesn't have a degree is literate. That's the problem with the law. The law is not the problem. But what you're going to find is in the soundbite the next day, Biden's going to say, Thomas Sowell thinks literacy tests are fine. And the average citizen who didn't watch this hearing is going to think, oh my God, Thomas Sowell and Robert Bork think that literacy tests are okay. Therefore, it's okay to discriminate against black people. And that's not what he said at all. And again, we're going to continue, and you're going to see Biden do this again and again and again. He's already done it several times. He's just looking for a soundbite. He's just looking for a snippet. And you can tell, and you know this because he knows darn well what Thomas Sowell thinks and, by extension, what Robert Bork thinks. But he continues this charade.
Applying the law differently.
So literacy tests, as long as they were equally applied, are all right.
Sure.
So I thought you thought.
See, that's what I thought you thought. He knew. He didn't have to go through that whole charade, but he did. And that's going to be the headline the next day. He thinks the literacy tests are okay, and people aren't going to know. What he means is they're okay as long as they're equally applied. In the specific example I gave you, it was okay to let a black person vote, but not let a white person vote if they're not literate. It continues.
Now, I also want to clarify, I gather from your comments about MIT and Harvard that you don't think there's enough blacks out there who are qualified to fill the number of vacancies allotted for them in those schools. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, the word qualified really is misleading.
Well,
the question is whether or not they are like the other students at Harvard and MIT.
Well, okay. Oh, so there's not...
So they may be perfectly qualified. This same student might go through, God help us, I hope there's nobody here from Illinois, Illinois Institute of Technology and do well. But there's no reason why he should fail at MIT. There's no prestige in flunking out of the Ivy League.
I got it. So, but my point is, you believe there are not enough black women and men out there that are the same as white women and men to be able to go through Harvard and MIT.
If there were, it would mean that the whole history of oppression had done no harm whatever.
Well, so the answer...
And that is actually a rhetorical kill shot. I mean, that should end it right there. I mean, yeah, Biden, if you're saying there's just as many qualified as there are whites, then how is this during the oppression, if that's the case? It should be the end of it. And you'll notice here in this line of questioning again and again and again, he's saying, what you think, what you think, what you think. It's not what Thomas Sowell thinks. It either is or it isn't. This isn't a matter of thinking. It's a question of whether or not they're qualified people or not. And this is a typical Biden signature. He's going to run the line the next day. Thomas Sowell thinks there aren't enough qualified black people. Thomas Sowell thinks black people shouldn't be allowed into the Ivy League. That's going to be the headline. And this is, again, it's all a setup. Years later, it's easy to see. At the time, it wasn't so easy to see. But anyway, the hearing continues.
I don't think there are. I just want to figure out what you're saying.
It's not a question what I think. It's a factual matter.
So factually, you're saying factually there are not enough.
Factually, this study's already been done by Clickguard at Harvard, and the figures are all there. Anyone can look them up.
Okay, no, I just want to hear from you. I want to know what you're thinking.
So again, that's really sort of the last thing in the hearing that's really important. But again, there's Biden. I just want to know what you think. I want to know what you think. And you heard what Sowell said. The studies have already been there. And what was happening, just so you understand, what was happening then was the Ivy League and these other schools were just setting aside slots for black candidates, and all they wanted to do was make a point and look better. And they didn't really care if the black people were qualified or not. And so, again, what Thomas Sowell had said was absolutely true. You'd have people that were getting in and weren't able to continue or do the work, and they were having to flunk out. And these people were just basically being sacrificial lambs to make Biden's point. But this is what he would do time and time again. There's one more couple things he does here, and then we'll finish the video.
Have you read all of Judge Bork's cases or any of them? Have you read all of his writings?
I haven't read all of them, but I've been reading them for more than 20 years because I used to teach antitrust economics.
Now, are you part of what they call the law and economics school? You know that.
So what's going on there? And I just left that in there because it's kind of an interesting little tidbit. And again, it makes my point that Biden is well prepared. I mean, he's not. He's got a staff that did it. The whole Senate, the Republicans and the Democrats, each have their own investigators. They do research. They figure out what's going on here. So Biden knows Thomas Sowell left and right. That's why he was able to parse through very quickly what he believed in terms of those things. But the point about law and economics is that Thomas Sowell and Bork as well, they were part of the law and economics school, which basically tried to blend law and economics in terms of what the good policy would be, right? And so typically, I think Richard Posner of the Seventh Circuit, he's probably long since retired, but he's probably the best law and economics person that you can think of, and wrote the book on it, in fact. And so what the point of it is there is that people that believe in law and economics should drive policy tend to be driven more based on facts and reasoning and less on emotional things like Biden wants to talk about. So again, he was not able to really successfully smear him there, because he laughed it off and said, look, I don't think of myself as part of a group or not. But so from this hearing, what you would see happen is, and again, unfortunately, Biden would also be the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee when Clarence Thomas would come before him several years later in the early 90s. He was a George Herbert Walker Bush nominee. He replaced Thurgood Marshall, who was the first black Supreme Court justice to sit on the Supreme Court. And when George Herbert Walker Bush nominated Clarence Thomas, Biden was still chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Now, you can sit here and wonder, how is it that he was able to remain chairperson of the Senate Judiciary Committee for that long? You'd think that's something that one person shouldn't have that kind of power over. And looking back now, it was a huge mistake. Well, what would become a signature, and again, he was the architect of this with Bork, starting to smear people, he would take to a new level with Clarence Thomas. With Clarence Thomas, it became what Justice Thomas referred to as a high-tech lynching. And so what had happened basically was he came before the Senate Judiciary Committee headed by Biden. He had made it out of committee. So the committee has to vote on you. He got a slight majority. It went pretty much down party lines, but he got a few Democrats to cross over. So Clarence Thomas was then going to the floor of the Senate. And that's when Biden decided to leak. Now, it's not been positively established that he did this, but everyone basically believes Biden leaked the Anita Hill claims to the press. Now, how do we know this? Well, here's why we know this is Clarence Thomas had already been through the FBI process twice before he was nominated and went through it a third time. So he had to go through an FBI investigation to become head of the EEOC. He had to go through an FBI background check to be nominated to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which also went through the Senate. And now he was coming before the Senate a third time with Biden being the chairman. So once he had gotten through committee, and again, the Anita Hill investigation by the FBI and just in his background had been revealed several times. So they knew about it. They'd looked into it, and they didn't think there was anything to it that would keep him from being the head of the EOC or on the D.C. Court of Appeals. Well, Biden, again, as he had done here with Bork, what he would do is smear people and try to smear you in the court of public opinion. He then moved that over to, with respect to Clarence Thomas, he's going to leak classified investigatory material to the press and let them make it a show. Now, of course, I mentioned earlier in the video that, ultimately that would lead to the Kavanaugh hearings where you don't even have to leak investigatory material. You can just have some witness from somewhere come forward and say things without any real proof of those things. But it all started in 1987 with the hearings of Robert Bork, right, where Biden was the chairman, and he absolutely made these a public circus and made a mockery of the whole process. So anyway, I hope you have found this video informative. If you had, please subscribe and share this so we can get this channel growing. And I will be back with future videos here, hopefully sooner rather than later.